August humidity pressed down on Augusta, Georgia, like a wet wool blanket, the kind that makes breathing feel like work. The air shimmered above the asphalt on Broad Street as the sun began its descent toward the Savannah River, painting the sky in shades of peach and violet that Georgians called God's own palette. It was the summer of 1991, and 16-year-old twins Colette and Nicolette Calloway were counting down the final weeks before their sophomore year at Glen Hills High School. The sisters emerged from Morrison's family restaurant just after 8 hours on the evening of August 14th. Their matching denim jackets tied around their waists, sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk as they laughed about something only twins understand. Security footage from Morrison's grainy and washed out, but preserved in the Michael County evidence vault for 3 decades, captured their final moments inside their restaurant. Colette pushed through the glass door first, her hair pulled back in a high ponytail that swung when she moved. Nicolette followed 3 steps behind, adjusting the strap of her backpack, her identical ponytail catching the last rays of sunlight. They had spent their evening shift buzzing tables and refilling sweet tea for the dinner crowd, pockets heavy with tips that would go toward new school clothes. The walk home should have taken them exactly 18 minutes along a route they had traveled hundreds of times before. Down Broad Street, past the Rexall Pharmacy, left onto Hickman Road through a neighborhood where porch lights glowed yellow and children's bicycles lay abandoned on front lawns. Then 6 blocks east, to the modest brick house where their mother would be waiting with leftover peach cobbler and questions about their shift. But somewhere between Morrison's glass door and their front porch, Colette and Nicolette Calloway stepped into an absence so complete it was as if the humid Georgia night had swallowed them whole. No screams pierced the evening quiet. No struggle disturbed the fireflies dancing above the manicured lawns. No witnesses reported anything unusual beyond a dark sedan, make and model unknown, idling near the intersection of Broad and Hickman around 8:15. By 9:30, when neither daughter had walked through the door or called to explain their delay, Evelyn Calloway felt the first cold finger of dread trace her spine. By 10 hours, she had driven their route twice, peering into the gathering darkness, her headlights scudding through the summer haze. By 11, her voice was horror from calling their names, and her hands shook as she dialed Michael County Sheriff's Department to report what every mother's instinct already knew with terrible certainty. 2 16-year-old girls had vanished from a safe neighborhood in less time than it takes to walk home from work. The distance between Morrison's restaurant and the hallway residence was exactly 1.2 million. Somewhere along that familiar path, in those 18 minutes that should have been unremarkable, something had transformed an ordinary Tuesday evening into the beginning of Augusta's longest nightmare. What made the disappearance truly impossible was not just the lack of evidence, but the complete absence of logic. The twins were inseparable, identical in appearance, but distinct enough in personality that friends could tell them apart within seconds of conversation. Colette, older by 4 minutes, carried herself with quiet confidence and dreamed of studying pre-law at Spelman College. Nicolette, more outgoing and spontaneous, wanted to be a veterinarian and filled notebooks with sketches of animals she hoped to save someday. Neither girl had boyfriends who might inspire reckless decisions. Neither had expressed any desire to run away or hinted at troubles that would make disappearing seem like a solution. The initial search mobilized Augusta with the fierce urgency that defined southern communities when one of their own goes missing. Within hours of Evelyn's call, neighbors formed search parties that combed every inch of their route. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like terrestrial stars as volunteers checked abandoned buildings, drainage ditches, wooded areas behind the strip mall on Broad Street. The First Baptist Church on Walton Way opened its fellowship hall as a command center, and by dawn on August 15th, over 300 people had gathered to coordinate the largest civilian search effort Michael County had witnessed in decades. Sheriff's deputies interviewed everyone who had been at Morrison's that evening. The restaurant manager confirmed the twins had clocked out at 8:07. A regular customer remembered Colette, bringing his check around 7:50, her smile bright despite obvious fatigue from a long shift. The cook recalled Nicolette, asking if she could take home leftover cornbread for their younger brother, Marcus. Every detail suggested 2 teenagers finishing an ordinary workday ready to go home. The dark sedan reported near Broad and Hickman became the investigation's first thread to pull. 3 witnesses mentioned seeing it, though their descriptions varied in frustrating ways. An elderly woman walking her terrier thought it was a Chevrolet, maybe dark blue or black. A teenager smoking on his front porch insisted it was a Ford, definitely black, with tinted windows. The pharmacist closing the Rexall recalled a dark vehicle, possibly burgundy, but couldn't swear to the maker or model. What all 3 agreed on was the time, approximately 8:15, and the behavior. The car was stopped but running, as if waiting for something or someone. Michael County Sheriff's Department generated a list of every dark sedan registered in Augusta and surrounding counties. 473 vehicles. Deputies began the exhausting process of locating each owner, checking alibis, looking for any connection to the Hall family or Morrison's restaurant. The investigation consumed every available resource, but with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding the girls alive diminished with mathematical cruelty. By the 3rd day, FBI agents had established a presence in Augusta, their federal resources and expertise joining local efforts. They interviewed the twins' classmates, analyzed their bedroom for clues about their state of mind, examined their school lockers for any hint of secret relationships or hidden troubles. What they found was heartbreakingly normal. Homework assignments completed in neat handwriting, posters of New Edition and Janet Jackson on the walls, a shared diary where the sisters recorded mundane teenage observations about classes, friends, and their dreams for the future. The last entry, dated August 13th, read simply, "One more year until we can get our licenses. Freedom is coming." The search expanded to encompass areas far beyond their walking route. Volunteers waded through creek beds and searched the banks of the Savannah River. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over Michael County, their technology useless against the passage of time and the dense canopy of Georgia pines. Tracking dogs followed scent trails that ended abruptly at the curb on Hickman Road, suggesting the twins had been placed in a vehicle. As August melted into September, with no breakthrough, no ransom demand, no bodies discovered, Augusta began the painful process of accepting an unacceptable reality. 2 bright, beloved daughters of their community had simply ceased to exist in the space between a restaurant's glass door and a mother's front porch. The search efforts continued, but hope transformed into the grim determination to at least recover remains to provide closure instead of answers. For 33 years, the question would haunt everyone who knew their names. What happened to Colette and Nicolette Calloway during those 18 minutes? The answer lay hidden closer than anyone imagined, buried not in the earth, but in plain sight, carried by a man who would walk among them for decades. His terrible secret sealed behind a smile that fooled an entire city. Before we continue deeper into this case that shook Georgia to its core, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. These stories connect us across distances, reminding us that the search for truth and justice knows no boundaries. The disappearance of the Holt twins marked the end of Augusta's innocence. The moment when doors that had never needed locks were bolted tight. When parents who had let their children roam freely began tracking their every movement. When a community that prided itself on neighborly trust learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. And somewhere in that humid Georgia night, a predator had taken 2 lives and would spend the next 3 decades living as if nothing had changed, attending the very vigils held in the twins' memory, offering sympathy to a mother whose grief he had caused. The case would go cold, buried under newer emergencies and limited resources, filed away in a basement where dust gathered on boxes labeled Calloway, Colette, and Nicolette. 1991. But the story doesn't end in that basement. It ends 3 decades later with a discovery, so shocking it would force Augusta to confront an uncomfortable truth about the monsters who hide in plain sight and the power of science to finally give voice to victims who had been silenced for far too long. The Michael County Sheriff's Department in 1991 was a competent but understaffed agency serving a population of nearly 200,000 spread across urban Augusta and the surrounding rural areas. Sheriff Roland Patterson, a 30-year veteran known more for his political savvy than investigative innovation, found himself thrust into the most high-profile case of his career, with resources stretched thin and expertise limited to routine crimes. The investigation into the Calloway twins' disappearance began with methodical determination, but quickly encountered the limitations that would plague it for years. Lead Detective Frank Morrison, a lean man with 22 years on the force, coordinated efforts from a cramped office where maps of Augusta covered every available wall surface. Red pins marked the twins' last known location at Morrison's restaurant. Blue pins traced their intended route home. Yellow pins indicated areas searched. But the map revealed more questions than answers. A geography of absence, where two teenagers had simply ceased to exist. The dark sedan sightings consumed the first weeks of investigation. Deputies tracked down every registered vehicle matching the vague descriptions, interviewing owners from dawn until well past midnight. The process yielded 3 persons of interest, who would remain under scrutiny for months, each eventually cleared, but never entirely forgotten by investigators who understood that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Marcus Delqua, a 41-year-old delivery driver for a medical supply company, owned a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice that matched one witness description. He had no connection to the Calloway family and no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket from 1987. His route log showed deliveries in Augusta on August 14th, but the timing was ambiguous. He claimed to have finished his shift at 7:30 and driven straight home to his apartment in the south side of town. His landlady thought she heard him arrive around 8, but couldn't be certain. Without evidence to contradict his account, detectives had to release him, though his name remained in the active file. Jerome Williams, a 28-year-old construction foreman, drove a black Ford Taurus and had been seen near Morrison's restaurant on multiple occasions. Williams had hired seasonal workers from the neighborhood and knew several families on Hickman Road, though not the hallways directly. More concerning was his history, a domestic violence arrest from 1988, where charges were dropped when his girlfriend refused to testify. Williams had no alibi for the evening of August 14th, claiming he was home alone watching television. Polygraph results were inconclusive. Detectives searched his vehicle and found nothing incriminating, but Williams's volatile temper and proximity to the area kept him on the suspect list. The third person of interest emerged from an unexpected direction. Robert Chen, a 35-year-old photographer who operated Asmall Portrait Studio on Broad Street 3 blocks from Morrison's, drove a burgundy Oldsmobile sedan. Chen had photographed the Hall twins for their school portraits the previous spring and had mentioned to colleagues that they were particularly photogenic. When questioned, Chen became defensive, insisting his professional interest was being misconstrued. He had been at his studio until 8:30 on August 14th, developing photographs in his dark room, alone and unable to prove it. A search of his studio revealed nothing suspicious beyond the uncomfortable reality that he had retained copies of the twins' portrait proofs, something he claimed was standard practice, but which made investigators deeply uneasy. All 3 men submitted to questioning, polygraphs, and vehicle searches. All 3 remained free because suspicion, however strong, isn't evidence. The frustration of having potential suspects but no way to eliminate or charge them ate at Detective Morrison like acid. Years later, he would tell a reporter, "I knew one of those men probably held the answer, but knowing and proving are different universes in law enforcement." As autumn arrived and school resumed without Colette and Nicolette in their seats at Glen Hills High School, the case began its inevitable drift toward the cold case files. The FBI scaled back its involvement as other emergencies demanded attention. Local media coverage shifted from daily updates to weekly features to occasional anniversary pieces. The volunteer search parties that had numbered in the hundreds dwindled to a dedicated core of family, friends, and church members who refused to abandon hope. For Evelyn Calloway, the mother who had reported her daughters missing, the investigation's gradual window felt like a second loss, equally devastating as the first. A 38-year-old nurse at University Hospital, Evelyn had raised her 3 children alone after her husband's death from a heart attack when the twins were just 7. She had worked double shifts to provide stability and opportunity, believing that hard work and faith would shield her family from the worst of what the world could offer. The twins' disappearance shattered that belief with brutal finality. In the weeks following August 14th, Evelyn transformed her modest brick house into an informal command center that would remain operational for 3 decades. The dining room table disappeared beneath maps, flyers, and binders containing every piece of information about the case. A second phone line was installed, its number distributed on missing person posters that Evelyn printed at her own expense, and distributed throughout Georgia and neighboring states. The walls of what had been the twins' shared bedroom became a shrine where Evelyn preserved every detail exactly as they had left it. From the unmade beds to the textbooks open to pages they would never finish reading, Marcus Calloway, 13 years old when his sisters vanished, watched his mother's transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. Where grief might have broken another person, it seemed to forge Evelyn into something harder, more focused, more determined to extract meaning from tragedy. She attended every town hall meeting about community safety. She testified before the Georgia legislature about the need for faster response protocols in missing persons cases. She founded a support group for families of the missing that met monthly at First Baptist Church, providing comfort to others enduring similar nightmares. But Marcus also saw the cost of this transformation. His mother slept perhaps 4 hours a night. The rest spent poring over case files or making calls to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. She aged a decade in a single year, her hair going gray, her face developing deep lines that hadn't existed before August 14th. She maintained the twins' bedroom with religious devotion, changing the sheets weekly, dusting furniture that no one used, keeping the space ready for a homecoming she must have known on some level would never occur. The hallway case suffered from the same limitations that plagued many investigations from that era. Forensic capabilities in 1991 were primitive compared to what would emerge in subsequent decades. DNA analysis existed but was expensive and time-consuming. Used primarily in cases where there was physical evidence to test, the Calloway investigation had no crime scene, no bodies, no items that might yield the genetic material that would revolutionize criminal justice within a few years. Security camera coverage was sparse in 1991. Beyond the single camera at Morrison's restaurant that captured the twins leaving work, there was no visual record of their movements. The route they walked home passed through residential neighborhoods where cameras were rarities considered, unnecessary in areas where everyone knew everyone, and crime was something that happened elsewhere. The investigation generated thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, and follow-up notes. But quantity couldn't compensate for the absence of the crucial physical evidence that might have transformed suspicion into certainty. Detective Morrison kept working the case even as other investigations demanded his attention, making calls on his own time, following up on tips that continued to trickle in from across the country. Each one requiring investigation despite a diminishing probability of relevance. The case officially went cold in 1993, though it was never formally closed. The designation simply meant that active daily investigation ceased, replaced by periodic reviews and responses to new information. The file boxes moved to the evidence storage facility in the basement of the Michael County Courthouse, where they would sit undisturbed for years, waiting for technology and circumstance to finally align in pursuit of justice delayed, but not denied. Time moves differently for families of the missing. While Augusta evolved around them, transforming from a mid-sized southern city into a sprawling metropolitan area, the Calloway household remained frozen in August 1991. The calendar on the kitchen wall stayed turned to that month for 3 years, before Evelyn finally allowed Marcus to change it. And even then, she circled the 14th in red marker every month, a permanent reminder of the day her world split in two. The 1991s brought changes that made the twins' disappearance feel increasingly distant to everyone except those who carried the grief. Morrison's family restaurant closed in 1995, replaced by a chain drugstore whose employees knew nothing of the history embedded in that location. The neighborhood along Hickman Road saw gradual turnover as original residents retired to Florida or passed away, replaced by families who had never heard the hallway name. Glen Hills High School renovated its buildings and updated its records. And eventually, the twins' yearbook photos became artifacts of an era, rather than reminders of an ongoing tragedy. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1998 with the whole case still listed among his unsolved files. At his retirement party, colleagues noticed he spent more time talking about the missing twins than celebrating his own career. He kept copies of the case files at his home in a spare bedroom that his wife jokingly called Frank's obsession room, where he would spend hours rereading witness statements and studying maps, searching for the pattern he convinced himself was there, hidden in plain sight. The case received periodic attention when new investigative techniques emerged. In 1995, the Michael County Sheriff's Department announced it would review old evidence using newly available DNA analysis methods. Evelyn Calloway's hopes surged, only to crash when investigators explained they had no biological evidence to test. Without a crime scene, without the twins' bodies, without any physical material that might contain genetic information, the revolutionary science that was solving cases across the country had nothing to work with in the Calloway investigation. The turn of the millennium brought another review, this time using computer modeling to create probability maps of where the twins might have been taken. FBI analysts input every known variable, generating scenarios that ranged from abduction by a stranger to voluntary departure to tragic accident. The models were sophisticated but ultimately useless without new evidence to test their hypotheses against reality. Marcus Calloway graduated from Glen Hills High School in 1995, accepted a scholarship to Georgia Southern University, and tried to build a life separate from the tragedy that defined his childhood. But Augusta pulled him back. After earning a degree in criminal justice, he joined the Michael County Sheriff's Department in 2000. Driven by a motivation his academy instructors found both admirable and concerning. Everyone knew why Marcus Calloway wanted to be a law enforcement officer, and everyone wondered if that reason would help or hinder his career. Evelyn continued her vigil with unwavering dedication. Every August 14th, she organized a candlelight ceremony at First Baptist Church, drawing crowds that numbered in the hundreds during the early years, dwindling to dozens by the 2000s, eventually shrinking to a core group of family and the most dedicated friends. She spoke at each ceremony, her voice never wavering, her message never changing. Someone knows what happened to my daughters, and until they speak, I will keep asking. The missing persons posters that Evelyn had printed and distributed in 1991 became historical documents. The twins' faces forever 15 smiled from yellowed flyers that occasionally surfaced in old filing cabinets or between the pages of forgotten books. Age progression images were created in 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010, showing what Colette and Nicolette might look like as they aged. But these computerized predictions felt hollow to Evelyn, who knew in her heart that her daughters had never gotten the chance to age past that August evening. The Calloway case became part of Augusta's collective memory, a cautionary tale told to each new generation of teenagers about the dangers that could lurk even in familiar places. Parents used it to justify stricter rules and earlier curfews. Teachers referenced it during safety assemblies. The story took on an almost mythical quality, the details softening and distorting over time until some younger residents weren't entirely sure if the twins had been real people or urban legend. But they had been real. The evidence of their existence filled Evelyn's house. Photographs documenting their progression from identical infants to gangly middle schoolers to the poised 16-year-olds who walked out of Morrison's restaurant one last time. Report cards showing steady B averages and teacher comments praising their kindness. A shared diary filled with observations about friends and homework and the small dramas that constitute teenage life. These artifacts proved that Colette and Nicolette Calloway had lived, had dreams, had futures that were stolen in 18 minutes. The investigation's periodic reviews always reached the same frustrating conclusion without new evidence or witness testimony. The case remained unsolvable. The three original persons of interest were re-entered multiple times over the years. Marcus Delacroix died in a car accident in 2003. Jerome Williams served time for assault in 2007, but was never charged with anything related to the twins. Robert Chen closed his photography studio in 2010 and moved to Florida, leaving no forwarding address. As 2020 approached, marking 3 decades since the disappearance, Evelyn Calloway was 71 years old and in failing health, diabetes and heart disease, exacerbated by decades of stress and sleepless nights, had taken their toll. She knew, though she never spoke it aloud, that time was running out for her to get the answers she had devoted her life to finding. Marcus, now a detective himself in the same department where his mother's case had gone cold, watched his mother's decline with helpless frustration. He had joined law enforcement specifically to help solve his sister's disappearance, but found himself hamstrung by the same limitations that had stopped the original investigation. No new evidence, no witnesses coming forward. Just the same dead ends his predecessors had encountered. The 30th anniversary vigil in August 2920 was smaller than usual. CO-19 restrictions limiting the gathering to immediate family and a handful of faithful friends. Evelyn spoke from a wheelchair, her voice weaker, but her message unchanged. Marcus stood beside her, his uniform crisp, his face a mask of professional composure that cracked only when his mother's voice broke on certain words. Daughters, justice, truth. What none of them knew as they stood in the parking lot of First Baptist Church, candles flickering in the humid Georgia night, was that the answer to their decades-long question was closer than they had ever imagined, waiting in a place that had been overlooked simply because it seemed too obvious, too mundane, too close to the original search area to possibly contain the secret that had eluded them for 30 years. Chapter 4. The Discovery in the Darkness. November 2023 arrived in Augusta with unseasonable warmth, the kind of false spring that makes Georgians suspicious of what winter might bring in retaliation. Deputy Sarah Chen, no relation to the long-departed photographer Robert Chen, was 26 years old and new enough to the Michael County Sheriff's Department that she still got assigned the calls no one else wanted. Trespassing at abandoned properties, noise complaints, welfare checks on elderly residents who hadn't been seen in days. The call that came through dispatch at 2:15 on the afternoon of November 9th seemed routine enough. A construction crew preparing to demolish an old warehouse on Industrial Boulevard had reported possible human remains discovered during preliminary excavation. Chen responded with the weary expectation that she would find animal bones or historical burial sites, something requiring paperwork but not investigation. The warehouse had been part of Augusta's industrial corridor into the 1950s, a sprawling complex that had housed everything from textile operations to furniture manufacturing before falling into disuse in the early 2000s. The building was scheduled for demolition to make way for a mixed-use development, another sign of Augusta's ongoing transformation from its industrial past into something newer and harder to define. Chen arrived to find the construction foreman, a weathered man named Tommy Wade, standing beside a backhoe whose bucket had been frozen in mid-lift. UDE's face had the gray pore of someone who had seen something they wished they could unsee. He pointed toward a section of exposed earth where the concrete floor had been broken up, revealing what had been hidden beneath for decades. The remains were in a shallow depression that had been covered by the warehouse's original foundation. Poured sometime in the 1950s, but expanded with additional concrete work in 1991, according to building permits Wade had reviewed. The bones were clearly human, two sets positioned close together, small enough to suggest teenagers or young adults. Scattered among the skeletal remains were fragments of fabric disintegrated by time, but preserving hints of denim and cotton, and there partially buried in thawed Georgia clay. Two tarnished pieces of jewelry that would transform this discovery from a tragic finding into the answer Augusta had been seeking for 33 years. Chen secured the scene immediately, calling for backup and the medical examiner while establishing a perimeter that kept the construction crew at a distance. Within an hour, the warehouse site had been transformed into a crime scene investigation that would consume the department's resources for weeks. Detective Marcus Calloway, now 46 years old, and heading the cold case unit they had essentially created through years of persistent advocacy, received the call while reviewing files in his office. The voice on the other end was careful, professional, aware of the weight of what it was about to say. Detective Calloway, we have a situation at the Industrial Boulevard warehouse site. Human remains, possibly two individuals, possibly female, possibly juvenile. And sir, there are two necklaces matching silver hearts with inscriptions. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had spent 23 years in law enforcement, 15 of them specifically focused on cold cases, with his sister's disappearance, the ghost that haunted every case he worked. He had prepared himself for this moment in theory, had imagined receiving this call countless times, but the reality hit him with physical force that left him momentarily unable to speak. The silver heart necklaces had been birthday gifts from their mother in 1989, each engraved with a twin's name and birth date. Colette had been on a slightly longer chain to help people tell them apart. Nicolette had complained that the different lengths made her feel like the younger, shorter twin, even though they were identical in height. It was the kind of minor sibling dispute that becomes unbearably poignant in retrospect. Marcus called his mother before driving to the scene, a conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds, because neither of them could trust their voices beyond the essential information. Remains found, necklaces present, waiting for confirmation. He heard her sharp intake of breath, the sound of the phone being set down, the distant sound of weeping. Then he was in his vehicle driving across Augusta toward a warehouse he had passed 1,000 times, without knowing it held the answer his family had been seeking since he was 13 years old. The excavation site took on the character of an archaeological dig as forensic anthropologists from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation supervised the careful recovery of every bone, every fabric fragment, every potential piece of evidence. The warehouse's construction history became crucial evidence. Building permits showed that in August 1991, an emergency concrete pour had been authorized to repair structural issues with the foundation. The contractor listed on the permit was a small local company that had gone out of business in 1997, but archived records revealed the crew foreman's name, Jerome Williams. The name detonated in Marcus's mind like a flashbang grenade. Jerome Williams, one of the original 3 persons of interest from 1991, the construction foreman with a history of violence and no alibi for August 14th. The man who had been questioned, polygraphed, and ultimately released because suspicion without evidence isn't enough to hold someone, let alone charge them with murder. The forensic examination of the remains proceeded with painstaking precision. DNA would provide absolute confirmation, but the preliminary assessment already pointed to a conclusion that felt inevitable. 2 female skeletons approximately 15 years old, based on bone development and dental analysis. The positioning suggested they had been placed in the excavated area together, lying parallel, as if arranged with some care rather than simply dumped. Fabric fragments matched the descriptions of clothing the twins had been wearing when they left. Morrison's restaurant denim and cotton that had survived 3 decades underground. The breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 33 years came not from the skeletal remains themselves, but from the soil analysis that modern forensic science could perform. Samples taken from around the bones contained microscopic traces of materials that told a story the bones alone could not. Concrete dust with a chemical composition matching the emergency pour from August 1991. Pollen from plants that bloomed in mid-August in Georgia, and most significantly traces of a specific type of industrial adhesive used in construction during that era, a brand that had been discontinued in 1995 after concerns about its health effects. Cross-referencing purchase records for that adhesive, still maintained in the archives of the manufacturer's successor company, revealed that Jerome Williams's construction company had been one of the primary buyers in the Augusta area during 1991. The adhesive had been used for bonding rebar to concrete and foundation work, exactly the type of work Williams's crew had performed at the warehouse in August 1991. The investigation accelerated with a momentum that felt almost miraculous after decades of stagnation. Williams, now 61 years old, was located living in a modest apartment on the south side of Augusta, working part-time as a maintenance supervisor at a storage facility. Surveillance established his routines while investigators built their case, knowing they would have one chance to get this right. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Williams's ex-wife, divorced from him since 1998, contacted the tip line after seeing news coverage of the discovery. She had information she claimed to have been too frightened to reveal 30 years earlier. Information about her then-husband's behavior in the days following August 14th, 1991. Linda Williams, now Linda Martinez, after remarrying, met with Detective Calloway at the Sheriff's Department on November 15th. She was 58 years old, hands trembling as she held a coffee cup, eyes reflecting the weight of carrying a secret for 3 decades. Her testimony would provide the human context for the forensic evidence, the why behind the what. He came home that night covered in red clay, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. August 14th, 1991. I remember because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays he usually finished work by 6 to my XO. But that night he didn't get home until almost midnight. His clothes were filthy, not just dirty from regular work, but stained with clay and concrete dust. He told me there had been an emergency at a job site, foundation work that couldn't wait. She paused, gathering courage to continue. The next morning, I noticed scratches on his arms. Deep ones like fingernail scratches. When I asked about them, he got angry in a way that scared me. He said I needed to mind my own business, that accidents happen on construction sites. I didn't push, because Jerry had a temper, and I had learned not to provoke it. Linda's testimony continued, detailing her ex-husband's behavior in the weeks following the twins' disappearance. He had become paranoid, obsessive about news coverage, angry when missing person posters appeared around the neighborhood. He had forbidden her from speaking to police when they canvassed the area, claiming they would twist innocent words into accusations, and most chillingly, he had insisted they attend one of the early vigils for the missing twins standing in the crowd. While Evelyn Calloway pleaded for information about her daughters, he wanted to see what people were saying, Linda explained. He wanted to know what the police knew. I didn't understand it at the time, or maybe I didn't want to understand it. But after we divorced and I had distance from him, I kept thinking about that night. The clay, the scratches, the paranoia, and I wondered if I had been married to a monster and just couldn't admit it to myself. The evidence was circumstantial, but accumulating into a pattern that felt unbreakable. Jerome Williams had the opportunity, working at the warehouse where the remains were found during the exact time frame when they were hidden. He had the means, access to equipment and materials needed to conceal bodies beneath fresh concrete. And now, thanks to his ex-wife's belated testimony, investigators had evidence of consciousness of guilt, the behavior of a man who knew he had done something terrible and was desperately trying to avoid detection. The arrest warrant was signed on November 18, 2023, as tactical officers surrounded Williams' apartment in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus Calloway stood in the command vehicle, watching through monitors as the man suspected of murdering his sisters was taken into custody. Williams emerged in his bathrobe, confused and indignant, demanding to know what this was about, until an officer read him his rights and the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Colette and Nicolette Calloway. The news broke across Augusta like a thunderclap. The revelation that the twins' killer had been identified decades after their disappearance, commanding headlines and leading every local newscast for a city that had carried this unsolved mystery for 33 years. The arrest felt simultaneously like relief and reopened wound, answer, and accusation. Chapter 5. The Man Next Door. Jerome Williams had lived in Augusta his entire life, a fact that made his arrest all the more disturbing to a community forced to confront how thoroughly a predator can embed himself in the fabric of ordinary existence. At 61, Williams presented a son remarkable, the kind of man you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. Average height, weathered face, thinning gray hair, and hands scarred from decades of construction work. Nothing about his appearance suggested the capacity for the violence he was accused of committing. His neighbors at the apartment complex on Peach Orchard Road expressed the shock that always accompanied such revelations. "He helped me carry groceries when my hip was bad," said Eleanor Foster, a 73-year-old widow who lived 2 doors down. "He fixed my leaking faucet last spring and wouldn't take any payment." How do you reconcile that kindness with what they're saying he did? The investigation into Williams' background revealed a pattern that forensic psychologists recognize as typical of violent offenders who successfully evade detection for decades. He maintained a veneer of normalcy, holding steady employment, paying his bills on time, avoiding behaviors that would draw law enforcement attention. But beneath that surface lurked a history of violence that had been minimized, excused, or deliberately hidden. The 1988 domestic violence arrest that had appeared in the original investigation had been far more serious than the police report suggested. Medical records obtained through subpoena showed that Williams's then-girlfriend had suffered a fractured orbital bone and multiple contusions consistent with repeated blows to the face. She had initially cooperated with prosecutors, but withdrew her complaint after Williams was released on bail, later telling a victim advocate that she feared for her life if she testified. The case was dismissed, the records buried, another warning sign that no one had connected to the twins' disappearance 2 years later. Further investigation revealed additional incidents that painted a darker picture. A 1986 bar fight where Williams had beaten a man unconscious over a perceived insult. Charges reduced to simple assault through a plea agreement. A 1992 incident where a female co-worker had complained about Williams' inappropriate comments and aggressive behavior resulting in his termination from a construction job, but no criminal charges. A 1998 domestic dispute settled to his divorce from Linda documented in court papers that described a pattern of intimidation and control. Each incident had been treated as isolated. The cumulative pattern never assembled into a coherent warning about Williams' capacity for violence against women. The system had failed not through dramatic oversight, but through the mundane bureaucratic reality that information doesn't automatically connect across different jurisdictions, different time periods, different agencies. The search of Williams' apartment, conducted with methodical thoroughness, yielded evidence that would prove crucial in court. In a storage unit Williams rented under a false name, investigators discovered a box containing newspaper clippings about the Hull twins' disappearance, including several front-page articles from August and September 1991. The clippings had been preserved carefully, protected in plastic sleeves, organized chronologically. It was the collection of someone obsessed with his own crime, someone who derived satisfaction from reliving it through media coverage. Also in the storage unit was a work journal Williams had maintained during his construction years, logging jobs and materials and crew assignments. The entry for August 14, 1991 was notable for its absence. The pages jumped from August 13th to August 15th, with the 14th apparently torn out. But forensic document examiners examining the journal under specialized lighting could read the impression of writing that had pressed through from the missing page onto the one beneath it. The words were fragmentary but devastating. Warehouse and foundation and emergency pour, and most chillingly, no one will know. The forensic evidence from the warehouse site provided the scientific certainty that would eliminate reasonable doubt. DNA extracted from bone marrow confirmed the remains were those of Colette and Nicolette Calloway, ending any slim possibility that the discovery might be coincidental. The microscopic trace evidence, the industrial adhesive, the concrete composition, the pollen profile, all supported the conclusion that the twins had been buried at the warehouse in August 1991 during the emergency foundation work that Jerome Williams had supervised. The medical examiner's analysis of the skeletal remains revealed cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skulls, consistent with a heavy instrument striking from behind. The twins had been attacked from the rear, given no opportunity to defend themselves or flee. The fracture pattern suggested a single powerful blow to each victim, delivered with the kind of force that comes from rage or determination or both. Reconstruction of the crime became possible through the combination of forensic evidence and Linda Williams's testimony. Investigators theorized that Jerome Williams, who had been a regular at Morrison's restaurant and had noticed the twins during their shifts, had followed them when they left work on August 14th. The dark sedan witnesses had seen idling near the corner of Broad, and Hickman was Williams' black Ford Taurus. He had intercepted the twins along their route home, possibly offering a ride as storm clouds gathered overhead, possibly simply forcing them into his vehicle. Why he had targeted them specifically remained unknown. Perhaps they had rejected his attention at the restaurant. Perhaps they simply represented opportunity. Young and vulnerable and following a predictable route, the psychology of predatory violence rarely offers satisfying explanations for the inexplicable. What was clear was that Williams had taken the twins to the warehouse where his crew was working, a location he controlled and could access after hours. He had killed them there, then used his position as construction foreman to arrange the emergency foundation pour that would conceal their bodies beneath fresh concrete. The next day, he had appeared at the job site with his crew, supervising the work that sealed his crime beneath tons of concrete and decades of silence. For 33 years, Williams had lived with this secret, attending vigils for the victims, watching their mother's public grief, observing law enforcement's frustration, knowing exactly where the twins were buried while the entire community searched in vain. Psychological evaluations ordered by the court would describe him as possessing narcissistic and antisocial personality traits, someone capable of committing atrocious acts without experiencing normal empathy or remorse. The community's reaction to Williams's arrest evolved from shock to a collective examination of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs. How many people had interacted with him over 3 decades, never suspecting his guilt? How many times had he driven past the warehouse that contained his victims, secure in the belief that his secret was perfectly kept for Marcus Calloway? Confronting his sister's killer required a professional detachment that fought against 33 years of accumulated grief and rage. He interviewed Williams 3 times before the trial, seeking answers to questions that had tormented his family for decades. Williams said little, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, offering no explanation and no apology. In one particularly tense interview, Marcus asked directly, "Why them?" "Why my sisters?" Williams met his gaze with empty eyes and replied, "I don't know what you're talking about. It was the response of a man who had spent 3 decades constructing a wall between his crime and his conscience, brick by brick, until he could genuinely believe his own denials. The arrest of Jerome Williams marked the transformation of the Calloway case from unsolved mystery to prosecutable crime. But it also marked something else. The moment when a family's 33-year wait for answers finally, impossibly came to an end. Chapter 6, Justice Delayed. The trial of Jerome Williams began on March 4, 2024, in the Michael County Superior Court, drawing media attention from across Georgia and beyond. The courtroom's oak-paneled walls and high ceiling lent gravitas to proceedings that felt less like a legal formality and more like a ritual of collective reckoning. Augusta had waited 33 years for this moment, and the gallery filled with spectators reflected that long accumulation of grief, rage, and desperate need for closure. Evelyn Calloway, now 74 and visibly frail, was wheeled into the courtroom by Marcus each morning of the trial. She wore the same navy blue dress every day, the one she had worn to the twins' 15th birthday party 2 months before they vanished. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her eyes remained fixed on Jerome Williams with an intensity that made court observers uncomfortable. She had waited more than half her life for this moment, and nothing, not failing health or emotional exhaustion, would keep her from witnessing every second. District Attorney Patricia Morrison, no relation to the detective who had worked the original case, presented the prosecution's evidence with methodical precision. She was 51 years old, a veteran of high-profile cases, but she later told reporters that the Calloway trial affected her more deeply than any case in her 26-year career. The jury saw crime scene photographs of the warehouse excavation, the skeletal remains positioned side by side, the tarnished heart necklaces that had survived 3 decades underground. They heard from forensic anthropologists who explained how bone analysis revealed the twins' age and cause of death. They examined evidence bags containing fabric fragments and soil samples, the scientific proof that transformed theory into certainty. Linda Williams took the stand on the 4th day of testimony, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. She recounted that August night in 1991 when her then-husband had come home covered in red clay and concrete dust, the scratches on his arms, his paranoid behavior in the weeks that followed. Defense attorney Robert Kramer attempted to discredit her testimony, suggesting that a bitter divorce had motivated her to fabricate accusations against her ex-husband. But Linda's response silenced the courtroom. "I've carried this for 33 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was too scared to speak when it mattered, and 2 families paid the price for my cowardice. I can't undo that, but I can tell the truth now and live with whatever consequences come from it." The forensic evidence proved overwhelming. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a trace evidence specialist from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, testified about the industrial adhesive found in soil samples from the burial site. She explained how this particular brand had been discontinued in 1995, making it possible to narrow the timeline and identify purchasers. The records showing Williams's construction company as a primary buyer were entered into evidence, accompanied by invoices bearing his signature. The prosecution's star witness was Detective Frank Morrison, the original lead investigator who had retired in 1998, but had never stopped thinking about the Hall twins. Now 78 years old and walking with a cane, Morrison took the stand and provided context that only someone who had lived with the case for decades could offer. He described the 1991 investigation, the 3 persons of interest, including Williams, the frustration of having suspicions but no evidence. His testimony carried the weight of professional regret. The knowledge that if forensic technology had been more advanced, if investigative resources had been more abundant, if just one piece of evidence had been discovered earlier, perhaps the twins' families wouldn't have endured 33 years of uncertainty. I interviewed Jerome Williams 4 times in 1991, Morrison testified, his voice heavy with emotion. He was nervous, defensive, but that could describe any number of people we questioned. We had no physical evidence connecting him to the twins. We had no witnesses placing him with them. All we had was gut instinct, and gut instinct isn't enough to arrest someone, let alone convict them. The defense's strategy focused on the passage of time and the reliability of decades-old memories. Kramer argued that Linda Williams' testimony was tainted by years of acrimony following a difficult divorce. He challenged the forensic evidence, suggesting that trace materials could have been introduced through contamination or coincidence. He emphasized that Williams had no prior convictions for violent crimes, a claim that ignored the pattern of violence documented in arrest reports and witness statements. Williams himself chose not to testify, a decision that surprised no one who had observed his demeanor throughout the trial. He sat at the defense table with an expression of studied indifference, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney, but showing no visible reaction to even the most damning testimony. Psychological experts would later describe this as consistent with antisocial personality disorder, the inability to connect emotionally with the suffering his actions had caused. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Marcus Calloway testified not as the investigating detective, but as a victim impact witness. He spoke about growing up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, watching his mother's life consumed by the search for answers, choosing a law enforcement career driven by the need to understand what had happened to Colette and Nicolette. His voice broke only once when describing the moment he received the call about the remains discovered at the warehouse. "For 33 years I've lived with 2 competing needs," Marcus said, facing the jury directly. "The need to hope that my sisters might somehow still be alive, and the need to know the truth even if it destroyed that hope. Finding them gave us truth but took away the last shred of possibility that this story might have a different ending. Justice can't restore what was taken from us, but it can't acknowledge that their lives mattered and their deaths demand accountability." The jury deliberated for 7 hours before reaching their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman, a retired teacher named Dorothy Ellis, stood to deliver the decision that would close a chapter in Augusta's history that had remained open for more than 3 decades. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jerome Williams, guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Colette Calloway." The words seemed to echo in the stillness that followed. "Then we, the jury, find the defendant, Jerome Williams, guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Nicolette Calloway." Evelyn Calloway collapsed into tears, her body shaking with sobs that represented not just relief but the release of 33 years of accumulated grief. Marcus held her, his own tears falling silently as the courtroom erupted in reaction. Some spectators wept, others embraced. A few called out words of gratitude to the jury. Judge Catherine Reynolds had to restore order with her gavel, though she made no effort to hide her own emotional response to the verdict. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Georgia law mandated life imprisonment for murder in the first degree, but Judge Reynolds had discretion regarding the possibility of parole. She took 20 minutes to explain her reasoning before announcing that Jerome Williams would serve 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in prison. "Mr. Williams, you robbed 2 young women of their futures," Reynolds said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "You robbed their family of 33 years that could have been spent healing instead of searching. You robbed this community of its sense of safety and trust. The law provides for mercy in appropriate circumstances, but I find none here. You will spend whatever remains of your life contemplating the enormity of what you've done, though I suspect you lack the capacity for genuine remorse." Williams showed no reaction to the sentence, maintaining the same empty expression he had worn throughout the trial. As officers led him from the courtroom in shackles, he didn't look back at the gallery where Evelyn Calloway sat, the mother whose daughters he had killed and whose life he had devastated. The conviction brought closure of a sort, but closure is never as simple as justice served. Evelyn lived just long enough to see Williams sentenced, passing away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, in June 2024. Marcus found her in the morning, still in the chair by the window where she had maintained her decades-long vigil. On her lap was a photograph of the twins at age 10, arms around each other, identical smiles, suggesting a future full of promise. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners who had followed the Calloway case for decades. Tributes focused not just on Evelyn's loss, but on her unwavering determination, her refusal to let her daughters be forgotten, her transformation of personal tragedy into advocacy that had helped other families navigate similar roles. The missing persons support group she had founded continued its monthly meetings, now led by others who understood the particular torment of waiting without answers. Marcus inherited his mother's house and faced the difficult task of deciding what to do with the bedroom his sisters had shared, preserved exactly as they had left it in 1991. He ultimately donated the twins' belongings to the Georgia Cold Case Archive, a repository established to maintain evidence and memories of victims whose cases had finally been solved. The archive would ensure that Colette and Nicolette Calloway were remembered not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives had value beyond their tragic end. The city of Augusta responded to the case's resolution with both relief and introspection. The vacant lot where the warehouse had stood was transformed into a memorial park dedicated to missing persons, with a granite monument bearing the twins' names and the simple inscription "Gone but never forgotten, found but never replaced." The park included a walking path lined with trees each, sponsored by families of missing persons from across Georgia, creating a living memorial that would grow and change with the seasons. Michael County Sheriff's Department established the Calloway Cold Case Initiative, committing resources to reviewing unsolved missing persons cases using modern forensic techniques. The program was funded through a combination of state grants and private donations, many from Augusta residents who had followed the twins case and wanted to ensure other families might receive answers without waiting 33 years. Marcus continued his work in law enforcement, now recognized as an expert in cold case investigation. He lectured at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, teaching younger officers that persistence matters, that cases are never truly cold as long as someone refuses to forget. That advances in forensic science mean today's impossible case might be tomorrow's solved mystery. Jerome Williams died in prison in November 2025, less than 2 years after his conviction. A heart attack took him in his sleep, denying victims' families the satisfaction of seeing him serve decades behind bars, but ensuring he never experienced freedom again. Marcus attended the notification meeting when the prison informed next of kin of Williams' death, finding himself surprised by his own lack of reaction. The man who had haunted his family for 33 years had become in the end just another statistic in the prison system. The Calloway case became a teaching tool in criminal justice programs across the country, illustrating how cases can be solved decades after they occur when persistent investigation combines with evolving forensic technology. It appeared in textbooks and documentaries, transformed from a specific tragedy into a symbol of hope for families still waiting for answers. But for those who'd lived through it, who had known Colette and Nicolette as real people rather than case studies, the resolution brought complicated emotions. Gladys Morrison, who had taught both twins in middle school, perhaps expressed it best at the Memorial Park dedication. "We got justice and that matters," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "But justice can't give us back what we lost." Two bright, kind, funny girls who should have grown up to be teachers or doctors or mothers or anything they wanted to be. Justice says their lives mattered. It doesn't say their deaths make sense. On warm August evenings, when the humidity hangs heavy and fireflies dance above the grass, people sometimes gather at the Memorial Park to remember. They bring flowers. They light candles. They tell stories about the twins who vanished one summer night in 1991 and were finally found 33 years later, buried beneath concrete, but never erased from memory. The case proved that time doesn't heal all wounds, but it can't prevent truth from eventually emerging. It demonstrated that justice delayed is still justice, that families' refusal to forget can outlast killers' belief that they've gotten away with their crimes, that science and persistence can combine to give voice to victims who were silenced but never truly lost. Colette and Nicolette Calloway remain forever 15 in photographs and memories, but their legacy extends beyond their brief lives. They taught a community that the search for truth requires patience and determination. They showed that ordinary people, Mothers who won't stop searching, brothers who become detectives, can accomplish what seems impossible. And they proved that some lights, once extinguished, can still illuminate the darkness if enough people refuse to let them be forgotten. The sun sets over Augusta now, as it did in August 1991, painting the sky in those same shades of peach and violet. But the city is different, marked by the knowledge that justice can come even after 33 years of waiting, that answers exist even when they seem impossibly distant, and that the simple act of refusing to forget can transform tragedy into something that helps others find their way home.